Okay, so we actually finished one more topic last time, okay, when I wrapped up IO. So we are done with three major components of the course, which is processes and threads, okay, which is essentially how do you deal with the CPU. We did how memory management, okay, so, and then we have done file systems, IO, device drivers, and so on. Okay, so three components done, one more to go, and that's what we are going to start today, which is distributed systems. This is essentially has to deal with the networking aspect of your machine. Okay, what does the OS do to facilitate communication? What can you do at the application level to write applications that communicate and do something together? We will look at a few different distributed system applications such as file systems, and we look at higher level applications very briefly like email and the web and so on. Okay. So that's coming up starting today. There will be at least a couple of guest lectures on some assorted topics this Wednesday, and I schedule them as the schedules of the people who are giving the guest lectures per me. So this week on Wednesday, we will do one on Linux. Okay, this is sort of broad brush. We looked at various aspects of operating systems. The goal would be to see how Linux implements some of these details. Okay, so in one lecture, which is not a whole lot of time, we'll look at the internals of Linux and try to understand what it does in terms of making decisions about variety of these things, the scheduler, the memory management, file systems, and so on. Okay, it's a guest lecture, as I said. Someone else is going to come present, and then I'm looking for at least one more special topic and or guest lecture. I'm not sure what that is going to be. Maybe it will be on cloud computing or something else. I need to look at who is available and what we can do. Okay, so those are a couple of additional things that we will do in addition to our regular lectures on distributed systems. Okay, so let's start with this new topic, distributed systems. We will start with the definition of what is a distributed system. It's very simple definition. There's a picture shown here. So essentially, a distributed system is a system that consists of physically separate processors that communicate over a network. Okay? Typically, these processors are individual machines. Okay? So a system of machines that have their independent processors that can communicate with one another to achieve some larger goal. Okay? It's a very generic definition of a distributed system. And we look at applications that are distributed as well as systems. Okay? Now the thing to keep in mind is, although we have not yet talked about this, most operating systems and indeed most systems today are distributed in some way. Okay? If you take any application that you work with typically, okay, well, let's say it's a web browser. Okay, it's part of a distributed system where the browser is a client and it's communicating with the web server, which is another machine that's running on that has its own processor somewhere else. Okay, email is the same way. Your mail clients and mail servers, whether it's a web-based mail, the client is a browser, or a full-fledged mail where you have a native client, the server is somewhere else. Okay, so your client and the server, two independent machines. Okay, those are the two processors that we talked about here, and they're talking over a network. The network could be in the internet as well. Okay. You can do network printers, remote backups, variety of different applications, whether you are doing social media applications of any sort, they're all distributed. Okay? You have applications on phones and tablets. Okay? Anytime these applications communicate with some other component, that's a distributed application, not just a standalone. Okay? So this is increasingly common. Although most applications you have seen thus far haven't used any networking or communication capabilities, this is far more common than standalone applications today in some shape or form. So before we actually start thinking about how to design distributed systems and what does the OS need to do, I wanted to distinguish between two somewhat overlapping concepts, and those are parallel systems and distributed systems. They are somewhat similar but not identical. Okay? So the way we will distinguish this is we will refer to systems as being tightly coupled or loosely coupled. In a tightly coupled system, you also have multiple processors. There is a communication medium. Okay? but these processors might share the clock, they might share memory, and they may also, depending on how they are set up, have only one OS running. Right? So parallel system is simplest way to understand a parallel system is any machine that has multiple cores. Okay? More than one processor, okay, if you have cores. Okay? The medium of communication may be the system bus. Okay? So it basically maps onto this model where this network becomes a bus. These processors are cores within a single machine. Okay? And we'll refer to that as a parallel system rather than a distributed system. Okay? Because they will actually be processors inside a box. You know, a box which is a machine, and if you have more than one processors in the box and the communication medium is inside the box, that's a parallel system, it's tightly coupled. Okay? Distributed systems, as we will define it, are more loosely coupled in that these processors are independent machines. They're not processors on the same single machine or inside a single box. They run independent kernels. Okay, they have have their own kernel. The kernels may communicate or talk to one another or coordinate closely, but they're still independent, separate. Each machine runs its own OS. Okay? And there is communication between them, but the communication goes over a real network rather than a system bus. Whether the network is Ethernet, the internet, whether it's cellular, whether it's wireless, doesn't matter. Okay? It is a network of some sort. Okay? Communication is not cheap. It is more expensive than tightly coupled systems. Okay? And there you are communicating over a system bus. Communication can be frequent. It's relatively inexpensive. Here communication requires you to send explicit messages over a network. Okay? So it is more expensive. So we'll distinguish between parallel and distributed systems. What we are going to talk about mostly is this. Okay? Although parallel systems and parallel computing is a very important topic, we are not going to look at it here in this class. Okay? That's topic of other courses that go beyond 377. Okay? Questions on this? Okay, so we'll talk about advantages of distributed systems. So why build applications and systems in this way? Okay, what do you get by allowing applications that run on these processors to communicate or talk to one another? Okay. So there are many examples, not examples, many benefits rather. First one is resource sharing. Okay. If an application on machine A can talk to something that's running on machine B, what you can enable by this communication is sharing of resources. The simplest things that you could share are you can actually access a file stored on a separate machine. The data does not have to be local anymore. Until now, we have assumed that all the files they are stored on your local disk that your application accesses. Now, if an application can talk to a different machine, you can access files and data stored on that machine. Data is no longer local. Now, this is, you don't even think of this when you do, let's say, go to your browser and access content over the web. You are actually accessing data stored on some other machine. So you enable sharing of resources. Those files that are on the web server become accessible to any machine that can send an HTTP request. Okay, so you can have resources that are shared, and in scenarios where these resources are expensive, you don't need to have multiple copies. You can share them. For example, you can have one printer that's shared over a network. You no longer need a local printer attached to your machine in order to print. You can have one printer that's somewhere on a network. You just send a print job to a print server and it will print it. Okay, so there are many examples of this sort. So resource sharing is a key benefit. Second benefit is computational speed up. Okay? Since there are more processors that are working together with the application, okay, you can actually do more than you could have done on a single machine. Okay? In particular, if you have n processors and n machines, and you are trying to execute an application or execute a job of some sort, you have n times the resources than you have on a single machine. Okay? So potentially you can have up to n times computational power and n times speed up. Okay? Now this is used in many different scenarios. Okay? Whether it is batch jobs that run in parallel. Okay? You did this MapReduce toy lab. Okay? It's actually based on a real system called MapReduce that allows you to do parallel data processing. There are lots of data. If you had only one machine to process it, it would take a long time. what you do is you chop that data up into smaller pieces and each machine processes it independently. You harness the computational power of n machines. That's an example. Cloud computing, same thing. So you can actually have servers running on many different machines on the cloud, and collectively they have more computational power than you could have on a single machine. So distributed systems allow you to harness the computational resources on multiple machines. That's an important example. Of course, when you do that, you need coordination, synchronization, and all of that, which comes with anything that involves sharing and using multiple processors and processes. Third big advantage is reliability. This is again something that we have not talked about much. If you have a centralized application and single machine, if that machine fails for any reason, OS crashes, hardware fails, disk dies, okay, your application is basically not going to function anymore. It will go down with the machine. Now, in a distributed system, since you have n machines and your application is partitioned and is running, not necessarily partitioned, but is basically distributed across n machines, the failure of any single machine in the system does not have to take down the entire application with it. Okay? Other machines and other parts, components of the applications can step in and do whatever was happening or take over whatever was happening on that machine. So in other words, if some machines fail, some subset of machines fail, your system as a whole continues to function. If you built your application, it's not going to be automatic. You have to take advantage of the fact that your application is distributed, and if you write your application well, faults will not actually bring your application. In large systems, very large systems, failures are not an exception, they are the common case. Okay? Some subset of nodes on your system will be down for any number of reasons. Hardware failures, maintenance, software patches, upgrades, something or the other has to be done. Okay, so some subset of your nodes will be down, but application as a whole continues to function. Okay, Google search engine, that is, Google search engine runs on tens of thousands of nodes, okay, that are distributed across many different sites across the world. At any given time, it is not uncommon for some fraction of those nodes to be down for whatever reason. But you don't see the system as a whole being down. The server doesn't, the search engine doesn't stop functioning because 10 nodes are down for whatever reason. That's not the case in centralized application. So because if you have one failure, the system goes down. So reliability is a very important advantage. It doesn't come for free. Your application becomes more complex because you have to explicitly deal with failures, take over responsibility of failed nodes. All of that has to be built into the application. But so long as you build your application right, this is an important advantage. Yeah, and the last thing that your system enables you is communication. Okay. Applications communicate, people communicate using these applications. Okay, so you can have email, you can have whatever chats, you can have social media. All of these allow you to communicate from people, allows people to communicate. Systems can also communicate. If you have banks and airlines, the reservation systems, they can talk to one another to enable you to book airline tickets or book travel and so on. So it enables communication at various levels, allows people to communicate, allows systems to communicate to achieve various goals. Okay, so with that background, what we want to do in the next few classes is to understand, okay, what does the OS need to do in order to enable distributed systems to be built and deployed. Okay, because this is a course on operating systems. So we are going to think about a few of these topics. So we don't have time to go into all of them. Okay, this is actually the subject matter of a graduate level course, okay, which is a distributed systems class. So here we have maybe 2 or 3 lectures to go into this topic. So we'll do a broad brush, high level overview, the style discussion of distributed systems. But these are really the issues we have to think about. Okay? What kind of communication and networks will we use for our application? Okay? Typically the answer may be you may use the internet or you may use a local area network. I'll talk a little bit about networking today. Okay? Another big topic in distributed system is this notion of transparency. Okay? Transparency essentially says how much of the fact that your system is distributed is exposed to the user and how much of it is hidden from the user. Right? Simplest way to understand this is I just gave the example of Google search engine. Right? So if you want to send any search query, you just go to Google and you send the query. Okay? The fact that there may be 10 or 100,000 machines in the background, some of which will actually actively work on your search query and send you back the result, is hidden from you. Okay? Google doesn't tell you go to machine number 5035 and send your query there, because that's the one that is going to service your request. Okay? You just send the query and it figures out which machine in the back is actually going to service your query. Okay, so it is actually what is referred to as location transparent. Okay, the fact that there are multiple machines and some of them may be handling your request is all hidden from you. Okay, so it is basically an example of transparency. Okay. In some cases, some of these details may not be hidden from you. Okay, you may actually need to know that you're, like, let's say, take the example of remote login. If you're doing SSH to a machine, you have to specify which machine you're logging into. Okay? That's not transparent to you. Okay? You don't say, I want to just log into a server and not specify what server it is. Okay? You actually have to specify the name of the server. So depending on the application, the distributed application, okay, you may actually have to be aware of the details of which machines you're talking to, or you may not. So that's basically how you design it actually matters in at some level. Right? Security is another important topic which we will really gloss over here completely. Okay, so when you have the ability to access another machine, okay, there is good and bad that comes with it. The bad is that you have now exposed the machine to not only real users but all sorts of malicious users, malicious applications who also have access to that machine over a network. Okay. So when you design your distributed systems and applications, you have to deal with security as an important consideration. Otherwise, machines will get hacked and then your application will not function once it's hacked. So it is an important aspect, often overlooked and put in as an afterthought, but it's something that one has to keep in mind. Reliability, I already talked about, designing your systems to be reliable by ensuring that even if some components fail, the application as a whole doesn't fail. Performance and scalability is another important topic. When you build any large distributed application, if you don't build it well, okay, even though you have n machines, okay, you're not going to get that n times speed up. Okay, you probably have heard a lot about, you read the press about this healthcare website. An example of a distributed system very poorly designed. Okay, there are probably lots and lots of components that are not well designed, very poor performance, clearly doesn't scale. It cannot even handle 100 users that are accessing the site concurrently, let alone tens of thousands or millions of users. Okay. So that's an example of a system that was built without proper thought as to what should be the performance and scale. At the other end of the spectrum, you have systems like Google and Amazon and Facebook, which can really handle millions of concurrent users accessing them at the same time. And they don't seem to buckle under the stress. They scale gracefully as the load goes up. And that's an example of a well-designed system. So when you have distributed systems and you don't design them well, you have bottlenecks and you cause performance stalls, you're going to actually have trouble. Even though you may have lots of machines, they don't translate to good performance. Okay. And the last point is programming models. How do you write applications that take advantage of distributed systems? So, uh, so as far as this next three classes are concerned, we are only going to talk about the first bullet and the last bullet. Okay, so the middle part is mostly going to be not discussed at all, maybe alluded to once in a while. Okay, so today we'll start with the networking aspects. Okay, and if we have time, we'll start thinking about how do you do programming. Okay, we'll look at really Java and Java remote RMI, remote method invocation, as an example of how you write distributed application, in this case with Java. Okay, we'll talk about how to write client server applications and so on. Questions here? Is this clear? Okay, so this, as I said, the middle four bullets we will not really talk about much, but they're important issues when you design any distributed system. Okay, so few other things before we go on to talk about networking. So these are, so distributed system, I talked about several advantages. There are disadvantages as well. Okay? The system becomes more complex. Your centralized applications are straightforward. Okay, you have one process, maybe some number of threads within that process, and you write the code for that entire process. You know what each part of the code does, and you're done. Okay? You have a distributed application. Okay, you may have tens or hundreds of components. These components may have been written by individuals who are not necessarily talking to one another. Okay? And yet you want the system as a whole to function. Okay? This makes the application design a lot more complex. This is the most fundamental disadvantage of a distributed system. The distributed applications are typically more complex than centralized applications. They may not even be written by one person, okay, because they're large. Each components may have been designed independently. The components need to have well-defined interfaces that allow them to interact with one another. Okay, without that, the system as a whole is not going to function. And with that comes many different problems. Okay, first one is timing and synchronization. Okay. So this is something that you rarely think about when you have a centralized application. Okay, so when you have a single process, multiple threads, they run on one machine. Okay, they have a single clock. Okay, that's the clock on that machine, and you can use that to do a variety of things that require timing information. When you have a distributed application, each component of the application runs on a separate machine. Okay? And what is fundamentally the case here is each machine has its own clock. Okay? Clocks are typically not going to be very tightly synchronized. Okay? They may not be synchronized at all, or they may be synchronized using some protocol, but they may be off. Okay? So using timestamps that are derived from multiple machines and trying to reason using this timestamp is often going to lead you to some pitfalls. Okay? And I can give you some simple examples of where things can actually go very wrong. Okay, so you probably heard of this utility called Make, which allows you to automatically compile large applications. Yes, some of you heard. Okay, so I'll explain what this does. So Make is a utility that allows you to do incremental compilation. So if you have a project that has lots of source code files, okay, and you change some of them, okay, one way to recompile your application is to recompile all of the files and link them together to make one executable. Okay. But if you change only one file out of 100, okay, it's often wasteful to go and recompile those other 99 files. They haven't been changed. Okay. So what is useful is to only recompile the files that have changed and then link them together to recreate a new executable. Okay, that's what Make does. The way it actually works is it basically works by looking at timestamps. Okay, it says what is the last time the source file was modified. Okay, what's the last time the source file was compiled. Okay, if the file has been modified after the previous compilation, it needs to be recompiled because it has been changed. If the file was modified before the last time it was compiled, that means whatever you have compiled is still current. You don't need to recompile it. Okay, is that clear how Make works? Okay, so now you can take an example of this is a very common example. Okay, so if you have done any software development for any companies or anything like that, you will know that there are developer machines and there are build machines. Build machines are actually special machines that are built just to compile code and build your software, because your software may be very complex. With independent machine, you actually have, this is your workstation. You write code here and you save it. And this is where you will compile. You don't necessarily do it on the same machine. So let's say you change file foo.java here. That's part of a project. You save it. So basically, when you save it, it basically gets saved. It gets saved with some timestamp t. Okay. So when you build it here, so basically you are going to first build it, and Java is the wrong language. You don't compile Java. Let's make it C. Okay. When you build it here, there's an object file created foo.o. And then that is going to get some timestamp t prime. Yes, and typically this happens after you have saved the code. Okay, now, let's say you make a small change, okay, right after you compile, and then you get a new timestamp T2. And you go and say, let me now rebuild the code. Let me recompile it because I made some changes to this file. Now, the important thing to realize is these are independent machines. They have their own clocks. Okay? And the clocks may not be synchronous, they may be off. An arbitrary amount. They may be off by a few seconds, they may be off by a few minutes. Okay? So, in particular, if this clock is ahead of this clock, let's say this clock is, let's say here it is 12:05, and this is noon. The clocks are not synchronized. What might happen is, even though you modified the code and you saved it, okay, since you're compiling here and saving here, these are two different timestamps that are derived from two different clocks. The timestamp on the last compilation may still be newer than the timestamp of the most recent save. Okay? So you go and rebuild the code, the make file here is going to say, when did I actually compile it last? And it says T prime, maybe that was 12:03, that was 2 minutes ago. Okay? And then you say, what was the last save? You say it's noon because this is now. Although this event has actually happened after that event, your code is not going to get recompiled in this case. Your build will say, process will run and say, I recompiled it, but actually did not recompile, and you are going to see some problems. Code that you just saved is not part of your executable, and you will see some weird error. Okay? These kinds of problems happen all the time. Right? And I gave you this example just for you to appreciate that you cannot simply use timestamps that are derived from independent machines, compare those timestamps, which is exactly what make is doing, and say which of these two happened for later or first. Okay, was the source code modified after the last compilation or not? Okay, this, if your clock is not synchronous, you're going to have this pitfall. This does not happen on a single machine because you save the file on that machine and you compile it on the same machine. You use the same clock. So this inconsistency will never occur when you have the same clock. But you have two different unsynchronized clocks, you will have trouble. Okay, is that clear? What I just said? Okay, so keep that in mind. So now there are other problems as well. Okay, all of the things we talked about as far as synchronization, deadlocks, and all of that goes, okay, those also become more complex. Okay, now we always assume you can use locks or semaphores when you have threads on the same machine. Okay? Think of applications running on two different machines that have to share some object. Okay? This notion of a lock has to be generalized, okay? Because these are independent processes. They are not even running on the same machine. How do you do that? Okay? How do you do deadlock detection across machines? Okay? If there are processes on different machines that are all in a hold and wait pattern, how can you detect that? You cannot just see what's happening on this machine and make a decision. You have to have a global view. So all of these algorithms we have talked about, how to implement locks, how to do deadlock detection, deadlock recovery, all of them become more complicated when you have a distributed system, because fundamentally your application is scattered across multiple machines and not no longer on one machine. Okay, failure recovery I already mentioned is something you can do, but it is going to make your application more complex. Okay, so that's basically a broad brush, very quick intro. Okay, we'll come back to real applications and real distributed systems in our next class or the class after. What we will do today is just start with networking. Okay, now I'm not sure how many of you have taken 453. Anyone here? Okay, so if you've taken 453, this is just going to be very basic material you already know of. But if you haven't, you need to know something about networking in order to know something about distributed systems. Because fundamentally, all distributed systems use a network underneath. Okay, so I'm going to spend a few slides giving a sort of a primer on networking, and then we will start talking about client-server systems and distributed systems. Okay, so you probably at least know what a network is. Okay, so there are many different kinds of network. The two that we will worry about here are what are referred to as a local area network and a wide area network. A local area network, as the name suggests, is a network that spans a small, let's say a building or a room or something like that, where you have machines that are connected to the network that talk to one another in a small environment. Okay. Examples of local area networks may be Ethernet. They could be a Wi-Fi network that you're deployed in a home. Okay, that if you have a Wi-Fi in your home or your dorm room, That's a local area network, because it's basically constrained to a small environment, a room or a building or something along those lines, or even a campus might work. Okay. Now, local area networks use different technologies. I already mentioned two. It could be wired Ethernet, it could be wireless, and they have different speeds depending on what the technology does. You could have gigabit Ethernet that runs at a gigabit per second speed. You can have 10 gigabit Ethernet. You can have Wi-Fi. There is all flavors of Wi-Fi. There's A, B, G, N, and so on. Okay, so each technology revision, you have faster speeds. Okay, but so your speeds in the megabits or gigabits per second, typically on a LAN, okay, local area. Wide area networks are networks that span large geographies. Okay? They could be a region, a state, a country. They could even span continents. Okay? So that's wide area, because the network actually is going to span a very large area and allow you to connect machines that are spread across that large area. Okay? Typically, WANs are slower than LANs. Okay? The speeds are somewhat slower. They may be in megabits. Some are reaching gigabits. But here you are already looking at multi-gigabits per second. So typically the way this has been done is using telephone lines, which people don't use as much anymore. You use fiber. You can have microwave links there, wireless links. You can have satellite channels, and now you also have cellular, which is all your 3G, 4G, LTE. They are all networks that allow you to also communicate over the wide area. Bandwidths, as I said, are much lower. They're in the megabits or hundreds of megabits than gigabits per second. Okay, so as you if the network grows larger and spans larger distances, speed goes down. That's really the most important thing to keep in mind. Okay, the simplest example of a WAN is the internet. Yeah, that's a network of network, but it's a really wide area network that spans the entire globe. But there are also lots of private wide area networks, okay, which are not accessible from the outside. Many companies can have their own network that connect all of their branch offices. Okay, they are private networks, private WAN networks that you cannot access from the outside. Only if you're inside the firewall of the company can you actually access nodes on this network. Okay. And the way most of these network work is very simple. Okay, you assume that there are applications that want to communicate with one another. Okay, and they communicate by sending messages. And these messages actually reach the network. Okay, what happens is your data within the message is chopped up into smaller chunks called packets. And then each packet is sent from one node to another until it reaches the destination. There's usually a source node, that's the one sending the message. And there's a destination node, that's the one that's supposed to receive the message. And typically your message doesn't go from the source to the destination in one, as it's called, one hop. Okay? It basically goes through intermediate points. Each intermediate point forwards it to the next point until it reaches the destination. The intermediate points are switching points that are often referred to as routers. Okay, if you heard of a network router, okay, these are all nodes that sit in between on the network that receive packets and send it to the next hop in the destination. Okay, the path from the source to the destination may have many intermediate points. Okay, the node packets trickle from one node to another until they reach the destination. Okay. Now networks can, these nodes are shared. The routers can be shared. The links are also shared by many applications. Okay, typically, when you have a router or a link from one router to another, there may be many different applications, many organizations that are sending their packets, okay, over there. This is especially true in the internet. Okay, so you may actually have you and your neighbors all communicating over the link that goes to the first router, for example. Okay, and then from there, that may actually have even more sharing where other flows also go use the same link. Okay. So that's basically how communication happens in a network. Now, typically, the way you implement these packets that go from one node to another is through sort of something called a protocol. A protocol is a language that both the source and the destination or two hops along the way can speak so that they can communicate. Okay, you have to essentially speak the same language in order to communicate. Whether it's humans or computer, it's the same principle. Okay, if you speak different languages, you cannot communicate fundamentally. Same is true here. Okay, so protocol is a set of rules for communication that are agreed to by all parties, particularly the sender and the receiver. Okay. There are different kinds of protocols. You probably know of a whole bunch of them. HTTP is a protocol, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and that's used for web application. SMTP is another protocol that's used for mail, a simple mail transfer protocol. Heard of FTP, File Transfer Protocol. Yeah, these are all protocols. They are typically application level protocols, but there are many different kinds of protocols, as I will talk about in just a moment. Okay, so what is shown here, this picture shows what is called a protocol stack. This is basically the layering that you see typically inside the operating system, spanning all the way to the application in order for the communication to actually occur. Okay, so this part of the protocol stack is typically inside the OS. This is what the OS will implement for you. Some of these applications are not inside the OS, they are on top, and some of them may be somewhere in between. They may be implemented as libraries or other processes on your system and so on. And the way typically network packets are processed is application on machine A wants to communicate with application on machine B. Okay? This application could be a web browser. This application could be a web server. A web browser wants to send a request. In this case, it's an HTTP request from the client node, which is machine A, to the server node, machine B. So it is going to basically construct a message. In this case, it's HTTP request or a message, and hand it down to the OS. The packet will actually, or the message is going to traverse down the protocol stack. It's going to basically see processing at each of these layers. There's something called a transport network layer and so on. I'll talk about that. So it's going to go down the protocol stack, and then the machine is actually going to send it out on the network. Whether it's a wired network or Wi-Fi or cellular, doesn't matter, but it's going to go out on the network. Okay, it's going to reach the first hop. Okay. If this is a Wi-Fi network, this first hop is your Wi-Fi access point. If it's an Ethernet network, it could be a router. If it's a cellular, it could be your cell tower. Doesn't matter what it is. This is the first hop that's going to receive your packet. Okay, that packet is going to get processed by a part of the protocol stack that is on that running on that machine. It is going to decide where it's going to look at where does this packet need to go, okay, and say what other machine or what other router to send it to. Okay, and there may be more than one. Here you just have one intermediate point between the sender and the receiver. There will be a sequence of these typically. Packet goes from one router to another until it reaches the destination. And it's going to traverse up the protocol stack and is handed to your application. Okay. This is typically how communication takes place. Okay. This part of the protocol stack resides inside the kernel. Typically. The rest of it resides outside. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these layers there, but I just want to see if you got the basic idea. Okay, so you take an application level message, you chop it up into one or more packets. Okay, if the message is large, it may not fit inside a single packet. Okay, packets, think of packets as similar to disk blocks. If you have a large file, they don't fit inside a block, so file consists of multiple blocks. Same thing is true here. If you have a large message, it will not fit inside a single packet, so it will be chopped up into multiple packets. Each packet is sent independently. All these packets arrive at the other end, you reassemble them and construct the original message. Okay. So this is basically how communication takes place. Now what is shown here are all these layers in the protocol stack. This is the physical layer, data link, network, transport session, and so on. So the application layer is the application itself. Okay. It could be a browser, FTP client, mail client, some application that's communicating. Okay. And this transport layer, typically if you heard of this protocol stack called TCP/IP, which is what is used mostly in the internet. So this is the transport layer of that stack. Okay. So transport layer is responsible for end-to-end communication. Okay. The transport layer and this machine typically talks to the transport layer on that machine to decide what to do with each packet. Okay. Because packets can get lost when they are sent. They may not actually arrive at the destination. So the transport layer is responsible for deciding how fast to send packets. Is the network fast or slow? If it's slow, you can't really start blasting packets or your packets will disappear. If it's slow, then you have to send it at a certain rate. So the speed at which you send packets, or the rate rather at which you send packets, the need to do error recovery, all of that is dealt with by the transport layer. Network layer is responsible. So transport layer does end-to-end. Okay? Network layer does hop-by-hop communication. The network layer is always responsible for deciding what to do next. Okay, which machine should I send this packet to in order for it to eventually get to its destination. Okay, so what is referred to as network routing? Routing is the process of making a decision of where your packet goes next so that it eventually gets to its destination. So routing is done by the network layer. Okay, so you see that in these intermediate points only have a network layer. They don't have a transport layer because packets come there and you just decide where should I send it next. So you keep sending it until it progressively gets closer to its destination and reaches there. Okay. Data link layer is basically what you use, what technology you use for your communication on your LAN typically. Okay. So this could be Ethernet, okay. This could be Wi-Fi, cellular, whatever technology you use is basically your data link layer. The software that is responsible for communicating over the technology resides in the data link layer. The physical layer is the medium itself. If you use Ethernet, physical layer is the wires that you use for the packets to go out. If you use Wi-Fi or cellular, the physical medium is air, because you're sending packets over the air until they get to your destination. Okay, so this is basically a quick example of your protocol stack. Okay, and if you remember when I talked about the layered approach for designing kernels, many lectures ago, I said there's only one component in the OS that uses the layered approach, and that's the network protocol stack, and that's exactly what you see here. Each layer here only talks to the layer above and the layer below it, okay, but not other layers. So packets simply go down the protocol stack or come up the protocol stack, and each layer will either hand the packet to the next layer down or the next layer up, depending on whether you're sending or receiving. Okay. Any questions on this? Yes, question.
What determines the size of each packet? Because you said it's chopped up.
Okay, that's good. So what determines the size of each packet? Typically, it depends on what type of networking technology you're using. Okay. So if it's Ethernet, wired Ethernet, the technology assumes sort of the maximum size packet could be 1500 bytes. Okay. If you're using cellular, let's say you have a phone and it's communicating, the cellular technology decides what's the maximum size of a packet. If your message application level message is bigger, then you have to chop it up into those pieces to send them out, because the technology can only assume a certain maximum size. So it very much depends on the wireless or the wired medium and the technology. And different ones will have different sizes, max sizes. Any other questions here? Okay, so I talked about all of these already. So I'm going to just skip over this slide. Yeah, so here is basically the same protocol stack, but just showing you the sort of how it looks like in the TCP/IP world. Okay, so which is the most common protocol stack that you probably used or use. So here you have what is called 802.x. This is basically either your wired or wireless medium. 802.3 is wired. You have different kind. 802.11 is wireless. Okay, your Wi-Fi. So that's basically the protocols that you use for communication at the data link layer. Okay, IP is your network protocol. This is the IP part of TCP/IP. This is responsible for doing routing. Much of the internet runs on IP. IP stands for Internet Protocol. It's an acronym for Internet Protocol. So that's your network layer. The transport layer in case of TCP/IP is either TCP, the TCP part of TCP/IP. Okay, so that's basically so that's one protocol. It's another one called UDP. Okay, so these are two protocols. You can use either of those depending on the application. TCP/IP provides you extra features such as automatic detection of lost packets and retransmission of those packets and rate control and so on. UDP is a very simple protocol. It doesn't do any of that. It simply sends the packet, and if a packet gets to the other end, well and good. If it doesn't get to the other end, that's the application's problem. It has to figure out what to do. Okay. TCP will not do that. TCP will actually track what packets are going out, and if some packet is missing at the other end, that other end will tell the sender saying, please resend this packet because it got lost. And will make the sender resend those packets. So whatever is sent will eventually be received after some number of attempts. So depending on whether an application wants the network to do error recovery of lost packet and so on, or whether it wants to do it itself, you end up using TCP or UDP. The most common applications will simply use TCP today. Okay, but on LAN, you can sometimes use UDP because LAN is more reliable. The chances of lost packets are lower. So certain applications will use UDP. And then you have the middle layers, which I didn't talk about, the presentation and session layer. And there you will see that all of the protocols you typically know of, HTTP, SMTP, SSL, all of those sit there, SSH, and so on. So those are presentation layer. At the very top, you have the application process. Could be browsers, terminals, any application, mail clients, mail servers. So that's essentially what your typical network protocol stack on your machine looks like. What I showed previously was a general protocol stack. And so you can have other protocols, not just TCP/IP, that map onto that. The most common ones are TCP/IP protocols. So that's, in that case, your protocol stack will look like this. Okay. So here is basically a figure that shows what a packet looks like. Okay, so typically your packet will have two components, what is called the payload and the headers. The payload is the actual data that's contained in the packet. Okay, in addition to the actual data, it will have extra information, the metadata. Okay, and those are typically put as headers and footers. Okay, so here you have your data, okay, and these are all this is all header information. Okay. Each layer of the protocol stack can add its own header. So the HTTP packet will have HTTP header and a payload. So when it goes to the TCP/IP layer, TCP/IP will take that entire thing that has come from the HTTP layer, add its own TCP header. IP will add its own IP headers and so on. Okay. And the header information is simply information that is used by either the next machine or the endpoint to decide what to do with the packet. Okay. So let's say packet comes over a network to a machine. Okay. The OS has to decide what this packet is, okay, which application is it for. Okay, just because a packet showed up, you don't know, is this a packet for your mail client, is it a packet for your browser, is it a packet that's for some other application. So all of that is basically inferred from what is in the header. Okay, so headers will basically tell you who is it for, what port to give it to, what's the sequence number of the packet, and what was the previous packet. So all of that information is typically in the header. Typically, there is also some footer information for every packet. This is used typically for error recovery. Okay, so packets can be corrupted when they're sent over a network. Okay, so if you just because you received a packet doesn't mean that it's error free. Okay, there may have been some bits in the packet that got flipped. Okay, so if you give bad data to the application will crash. Okay, so to check whether the packet was received successfully without any errors, we put some extra information here called checksums and other kinds of information that allow you to determine whether the packet got inadvertently altered in transit, corrupted, and whatnot. Okay, so footers allow you to do error checks. The headers allow you to decide what the packet should do, or what you do with the packet. And then the main part of the packet is the data itself, which is here. Okay. Here you see that it says up to 1500 bytes. That's an Ethernet packet, because that's the max size of an Ethernet frame. If you have different technology, this payload may be different. It's the maximum size of the payload. Okay, is that clear? Okay, so with that background, we'll talk a little bit about network topologies now, and then we'll start talking about client server application. Okay, so I talked about LAN and WAN. Okay, so those are just whether the network spans a building or whether the network spans something that is a much larger geographic region. But regardless of whether it's a LAN or a WAN, okay, you have to decide a topology of how nodes are connected to one another. Okay, how either the wires go or how the nodes actually talk to one another. And depending on the structure of that communication, you will get different topologies. Yes, the simplest one is referred to as fully connected. In a fully connected node, every node is directly connected to every other node in your system. Okay, so if you have let's say wired network, what this would mean is every node has a wire going from that node directly to every other node in the system. There are n nodes, there are n minus 1 wires going from every node to every other. So that's basically a fully connected graph topology. Okay. That's the most topology. So in this case, any message from any sender to any receiver takes not at most, exactly one hop. Okay, because every node has a direct connection. If you want to talk to any node I, you simply send a message along that path and it reaches the destination. So messages take a single hop, okay, because there's a direct connection. Okay. Failure of any one node doesn't impact the ability of other nodes to communicate. Okay. So if this node goes down, other nodes can still communicate because they're still connected to one another. It doesn't, failures don't impact communication in the network. Only that node can no longer communicate. And last but not least, this is the most expensive topology you can think of. Okay, it requires order n square links because the graph is a click. Okay, it's fully connected. Okay, so you will now typically you will not see this in a WAN. Okay, not every node in the internet has a direct connection to every other node. That doesn't make any sense. You won't even see it in a LAN. Okay, even in a LAN, you typically don't see fully connected topology. But that's sort of the beginning point of what a topology might look like. And you start relaxing that. Okay, so next topology, partially connected. As the name suggests, this is a partially connected graph. The graph is connected in that there is a path from any node to any other node, but now you may have to go through other nodes for communication to take place. Okay, so now you don't have a direct connection like before. So if this node wants to talk to this other node, you will have to send a message through other intermediate nodes, and each of them will have to forward that message until the message gets here. And there may be multiple paths. As you can see, there are two possible paths, one along the outer radius and one from the inside, that allows this node to talk to this node. Okay, so the message can take either of those paths to reach its destination. Okay. So this is less expensive to build. There are less wires. Okay, this is a wired network. Okay. But it's also less tolerant to failures. Okay. So if, for instance, this node goes down, the network is partitioned. Okay. Even though this node may be up, if the node before it goes down, this node can no longer communicate with the rest of the network. We have what is referred to as a network partition. Okay. In the partition here, sort of the network breaks into two parts, and within each part, nodes can talk to one another, but there is no path going from one partition to another anymore. Okay. So in a partially connected network, you may have network partition, which was not the case in fully connected. Okay. So you also need multiple hops that your message has to traverse, so you need routing algorithms. Okay, so the network layer or IP part of TCP/IP does routing, simply because most networks are partially connected. Okay, routing basically is a problem of deciding how should the message go from the sending machine to the recipient machine. Okay, and WANs and even LANs typically use this topology. Okay, so we do it fully connected, we did partially connected. The third up is tree structure. Okay. So this is a hierarchical structure for your network. Okay. Typically there is a root, okay, then there is a hierarchy. So you'll see that the network is structured like a tree. Okay. Typically you have in your organizations, okay, they have a hierarchical structure in many cases. Not always, but in many cases they have a hierarchical structure for the network. Okay. At the very top is the router that connects that entire organization to the rest of the internet. That's sort of the top node. That router may be connected to local router. So let's say you take the UMass campus. There may be one router. Okay, there's actually more than one, but in the simplest case, there'll be one router that connects all of UMass to the rest of the internet. That's the node at the top of the tree. Okay. Then you can assume that each college within the campus has its own router. Okay. So the top level router will then connect to each of the college level routers. So from the college level routers, you can come to each building or a department, and each building may have its own router. Okay, so that's basically the next level. And then within a building, there will be machines that will somehow connect to that router. Okay, that's a hierarchical structure. Same can be true in companies, okay, where you have one node at the top which connects the entire organization to the rest of the world. And then each department or each branch office may have its own router, and then you have a tree-like structure. Clearly, a tree is also a partially connected network. Okay, so everything I said about partially connected network essentially is true here. You will see that if some node gets dies in the middle, your tree is going to get partitioned. Okay, any node in the tree that goes down, your subtree is going to get partitioned from the rest of the tree. Okay, that's clearly true. If the CS router goes down, okay, we can still communicate inside the CS building, but we are no longer able to communicate to the rest of the campus. Okay, so same thing is true here. Okay, so fault tolerance is a problem because if nodes die, then you cannot have communication. Okay, next topology is the star topology. Okay, in the star topology, all nodes connect to a central node. Yes, there's a node in the middle, and to communicate with any node, you have to basically send your packet to the central node, which will then forward it to the recipient. Okay, so this is basically referred to as a star because the topology looks like a star. Okay, so each message takes 2 hops. Okay. If the outer nodes, one of them fail, that doesn't impact the rest of the network. But if the central node fails, your network goes down because that's the critical piece that enables all of your communication. Okay. So if you have a Wi-Fi access point, that's an example of a star topology because each client on your Wi-Fi network talks to the Wi-Fi access point. That's the one sitting in between. So if 2 machines on your Wi-Fi network, let's say it's a Wi-Fi printer and a Wi-Fi laptop, want to talk, all packets go to the Wi-Fi access point, which forwards it back to another. The Wi-Fi access point has also a connection to the rest of the world, which is not shown here. It's a simple star topology. Is that clear? Yeah, so that's star. And then there are other kinds of topologies like ring topologies, as shown here. The ring topology, all your nodes are arranged in a ring fashion. Okay, and then the way you send messages is you basically circulate the message along the ring. It can traverse clockwise or anti-clockwise, depends on how the ring is it unidirectional or bidirectional. And then the message will keep going from one hop to another until it reaches the destination. Okay, so this is going to simply use hop by hop communication. Okay, so given n nodes, if you have one directional ring, your message may take at most n minus 1 hop to get to the destination. Okay, so if you're basically going to send messages clockwise, okay, if this node wants to send a message to the node before it, the node message will have to circulate to the entire ring to go back to that node. Okay, so that's n minus 1 hops. Okay. If you had a bidirectional ring, which means messages could go either way, you send it along the shorter of the 2 paths. You see which is the destination, and if you there's the clockwise way or the anti-clockwise direction, take fewer hops and you send it in that direction. Okay, so you may need at most n over 2 hops in this case to reach any node in your ring. Okay. So early versions of LAN technologies, okay, used ring topologies. Okay. When in the very old days, there are 2 competing topologies. There was a ring you could actually, when you bought a machine, you have to say, do you want Ethernet or do you want token ring, which was the ring topology. So the answer dependent on what was in your office building, whether the building was built using Ethernet or built using token ring. Okay, there are 2 competing technologies, and for a while they both existed, and then after a while, you know what happened. Right? The token ring technology died out. Okay, Ethernet was more successful and it took over. So now you don't actually have this debate. You simply basically only use Ethernet. Okay, but in the old days, if you bought a PC, you had to say what kind of network card did you want. You want an Ethernet card or a token ring card, depending on what network was actually used by your organization or your office building. Okay, so it was basically a popular LAN technologies in the 80s and 90s, not anymore. Okay, maybe 80s, not 90s. Okay, now the thing about the ring is basically it also you have to deal with failures. Okay, any node in the ring dies, okay, your ring is actually going to get partitioned. If it's unidirectional, you will basically partition. If it's bidirectional, you can start sending messages in the other direction to reach all the nodes. But there are still problems that arise due to failures and so on. Okay, if 2 nodes die, then the ring will break into 2. Okay, if you just simply slice off this node and this node, your ring is partitioned into 2, and you cannot have communication. So dealing with all these failures is a bigger problem. Okay, part of the reason why Ethernet is a much simpler technology, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, so rings did not really last that long as a LAN technology. Okay, so before we go on to Ethernet, there's also a doubly connected ring, which basically allows you to hop. So there's basically the outer ring, but then each node is not only connected to its previous and the next neighbor, it's connected to your neighbor's neighbor as well. So this is referred to as a doubly connected ring. So in this case, what you can do is basically essentially think of it as two rings. The inner ring allows you to basically, it's like the express lane, you're hopping across nodes. Okay, so you can directly send a message to that node by sending it along that link rather than the outer link. Okay, so you will basically send it along the fast path. So it basically traverses fewer hops until it gets too close to your destination, and then you will basically sort of switch to one of the two hops and then go to your destination. Okay, so if you have a doubly connected ring, the message will take at most n over 4 hops. Okay. So also a little more tolerant of failures, because if this node goes down, your ring is not partitioned because there is a link that hops over that node and talks to your neighbor's neighbor. If a neighbor is down, you can still communicate with the rest of the network. Yeah, so you can use techniques like this to deal with some failures. Yeah, of course, if your neighbor goes down and your neighbor's neighbor goes down, you're still in trouble. Yeah, but at least it handles neighbor failures. Yes.
If the neighbor goes down and its neighbor goes down, it's just one direction of
Yes, if
message
it's
passing
if
the
it is
other way.
unidirectional, you are in trouble. If it's bidirectional, you send messages the other way. Right, so it depends on what kind of a token ring, rather a ring network it is. Typically in bidirectional, some node failings will not take the network down. You start sending the node messages the other way. Only if there are multiple failures and your ring actually gets spliced into two, then you have trouble. Then your real network partition. Any other questions here? Okay, so we'll talk about some bus technology, bus-based or broadcast-based technologies, and then start talking a little bit about applications. Okay, so but as the name bus network topologies indicate, so these use shared communication medium. Okay, so this is the simplest example of a linear bus, where all the nodes are connected to this thing called a bus, and their bus is the network that is shared. Okay, so what happens in this case is only one node can send a message at any given time. If node A is sending a message, it's basically using the network to send that message to some other node. No other node can communicate. Is that clear? Just as if you have a system bus inside your machine, okay, if your two entities try to communicate at the same time, you will basically have what is referred to as a collision, okay, because it's a shared medium. Right? So you can only have one person talking. Okay, if multiple of you start, this is a shared medium also, your classroom. If 10 of you start talking, nobody can have proper communication because you will all drown out one another. Same is true here. Okay, only one node can talk at any time. Okay, so that's the shared medium. Now you should contrast that to point-to-point topologies here. Okay, so in this case, this node can talk to this node. At the same time, that node can talk to that other node because the messages go on different links. The links are not shared. Okay, so you can have concurrent communication in this case, okay, but you cannot have that necessarily in a shared medium. In this case, you are restricted to having only one node communicate with one another. Okay, this is what Ethernet uses. The Ethernet is a shared medium. Okay, the traditional Ethernet, you had these switches where when you send a packet, the packet is sent to all machines that are connected to your Ethernet. Only the recipient will actually accept delivery. The others will discard. Yes, the packet.
Something like a star network, are you limited in the amount of communications that can be happening at the same time as well?
So you're talking about star network here. Right?
Yeah.
So the question is, in the star network, are you limited by the communication? I would say it depends on whether it's wired or wireless. Okay? In wired, what could happen is multiple nodes can send packets to the central node. The central node has intermediate buffering, right? It can actually hold packets. So when it receives packets, it can then take one packet at a time and forward it to the destination. So if you have buffering and your wired network, you can do this. If you have wireless, okay, you have access point, let's say sitting on the wall there, 10 laptops all send the packets at the same time. Okay, they'll basically collide on the channel. Okay, basically, you will not be able to do that because you have a shared medium. Okay, because there are no dedicated wires. In this case, if there are dedicated wires, you can have packets going on different wires and they don't interfere. Okay, if the medium is actually air, You can only have one of them sending at any given time if you have one frequency band. If you have multiple frequency bands, they are like independent wires. Okay, so the answer really depends on what kind of technology it is. Okay, so linear bus shared medium. Okay, so nodes can only talk so it basically has to use some way by which only one node can talk to any other node on the network. So what happens in Ethernet is many times if multiple nodes start sending packets, you have what is called as a collision. Your packets collide on the network. If they get garbled and corrupted, then some nodes have to start backing off. They say, okay, there is some problem. We cannot all talk at the same time, so I'm going to hold off. Okay, and only one node that wins will actually get to send. Okay, so you need some way of arbitration. Okay, that has to be built into the protocol itself. Because otherwise, whenever you have what is referred to as multi-access technology, a shared medium where multiple nodes can send, you have to deal with the problem of what happens if multiple nodes start sending packets at the same time. Okay, because the packets will get corrupted on the medium, they will drown out one another. Same as when people start talking at the same time. So somebody has to back off. Okay, that is actually built into the protocol. Yes. Question is if the capacity of the bus is a gigabit per second and each node is only sending, let's say, a megabit per second, can they send at the same time? Okay, so the speed doesn't really matter. If you send at the exact same time, your packets will collide. The capacity doesn't matter. What the capacity does is it allows you to send the same number of bytes faster. If you have a 100 megabit per second network and a gigabit per second network, the second network is 10 times as fast. But doesn't mean it will allow more people to talk at the same time. It's fundamentally the same as saying whether you talk slow or talk fast doesn't matter. If two people talk at the same time, you're basically going to drown out one another. Okay, same thing. So what will happen in a faster network is your turn to send will come faster because the previous node will be done faster. That's all that's going to happen. You cannot still send at the same time. Okay. So linear bus Ethernet. So this is basically was the fundamental disadvantage. Token ring protocols allowed some communication to take place if they didn't collide. You could send concurrent packets, but here you couldn't. But in any case, this technology still seemed to have sort of won in the market and is now the one that you use commonly. Yeah, so that's basically linear bus. You also have shared ring, which is what is shown there, where there is a ring and all the nodes hang off the ring. The ring is still shared. So you inject a packet and then that's a shared bus and it will basically go to some node. So that's another way of having a bus-based technology. Okay, so this is the one that you want to keep in mind for a little bit. So let me talk a little bit about resource sharing and then we'll talk about client-server communication. Okay, so now with that background on networking, I'm done talking about the primer on networking is done. We'll come back to distributed systems. Okay, so let's say you want to build some application that needs to share some resources. Okay, so distributed applications will fall into one of these three categories. Okay, they are referred to as resource sharing using what is referred to as data migration, computation migration, or job migration. Okay, so if two applications are in a part of a distributed system, the way they are going to share resources is either data is going to move to the application that wants it, okay, computation is going to move to where the data is, okay, or the job itself will actually move to where the data and resources are. Okay. These are three different ways of writing your application. Okay. They result in different trade-offs, but I'll just give you some examples of job and computation migration. So think of some distributed applications that you use on a day-to-day basis. Can you think of any that involves computation migration? Can you send a computational task to where the data is? Yes. Can you speak up? Wolfram Alpha, can you explain what? No, I know what it is. You explain for the rest of the class. Okay. Okay. So I'll just generalize what you said and say any search engine is an example of computation migration. When you specify a keyword query, a query is a program, it's a computation. Okay, so you basically type in some search query, it's a computation. The data is the index that Google has created. It's sitting somewhere else. Right? Your query, which is your computation, is going to where the data is. It's actually going to access the data, pull the right subset of the result, and come back to you. It's a distributed application where computations are migrating to where the data is. Okay. Now, what about the other way around? What applications can we think of where the data moves to where the computation is? Yes. Email. Okay, so your mail client is local. It's pulling your email from the server to where your client is, and then it's rendering it and showing it. Right, so just an example. Yes. So you can have state on different machines. Even when you're accessing remote files, if your application is accessing files over a network drive or network partition, the data is moving to where your application is. There's so many examples of data migration. Job migration is a harder concept. Typically, you won't see it very commonly used in most applications, but there are applications where the job actually moves from machine to machine and it gets serviced by different machines depending on where resources are available. Yes, simplest, yes. So it could be a build machine, or if you used these screensavers like SETI at home. You all know what SETI at home is? Some of you are nodding your head. So that's an example of job migration. So what happens in SETI at home is also referred to as volunteer computing. Okay, so let's say some group needs access to lots of machines to crunch some data, okay? But they don't have access to lots of machines. Neither do they have money to buy lots of machines. Okay, so what they do is basically ask for volunteers, saying, would you like to donate some CPU cycles of your machine when you are not using your machine? Right? The way this is done is you install a special screensaver on your machine. And the assumption is if your screensaver activates, you're not at your machine. And at that point, it's a special screensaver that actually sends a request to a server saying, user is not at their machine, he or she has agreed to donate cycles. This is a good time to use some of those cycles. So the screensaver goes and pulls a small job, and then the job actually crunches on your thing, and then it goes back. So your job has actually migrated from one machine to another. Yes, question. Yes. So botnets are a good example of volunteer computing where you didn't actually volunteer your machine. Somebody hacked into your machine and is sending spam or doing bad stuff. Right? But there are some legitimate uses of volunteer computing where, I mean, it's used for drug discovery. There are a lot of these researchers who are trying to discover drugs for cancer and things like this, but it needs a lot of horsepower. So people say that's a good cause. I'm going to donate some CPU cycles when I go for lunch or some such thing. Right? But yes, you're right that there are bad forms of job migration as well. Okay, viruses are an example of jobs migrating as well. Yeah, at some level. Okay. So that's basically resource sharing, and depending on what is cheap and what is expensive in your system, you can design your application where data moves to where the computation is, or the computation moves to where the data is. Okay, so if your communication is really cheap and you don't have a lot of data, you can bring all the data to the machine, all the data becomes local, accesses are very fast. Now, if computation is expensive or you have lots of data, it's better to send your computation to where the data is. Okay, you would never think of importing the entire Google index on your local machine and running your search query locally. That just doesn't work. Network is slow, there is a huge index, you cannot just download it. Okay, but if you have data caches, there are many applications where you can cache data locally. And you will see that file servers do this all the time. And then all the IOs become local. And so that's basically data migration. So which of those you use actually depends on what application it is, how much data there is, how fast is your network. Okay, so are you able to bring all the data? The ideal case is if you could bring the data over and do everything locally, that's going to be, you pay the one-time cost of bringing the data over, but then everything is local. but that's not always going to work. Your network may be slow, you may have far too much data to do that. So then you basically have to do computation migration. So these are general principles that you have to keep in mind when you design your application. And different applications make different choices, okay, depending on what is actually slow, what is expensive, what's local, what's remote. Okay, so we ran out of time today, so we're going to stop here and talk about the next set of topics, which include client servers and remote method communication and distributed file server next time. Okay.